Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll be starting in just 1 minute. All right, we are all set to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Jennifer Romano Bergstrom, the president of the User Experience Professionals Association, and we're very excited to bring you Conversational User Interfaces, Past and Present, with Crispin Reedy today. Before we begin, I just want to tell you a couple things about UXPA in case you weren't aware of our organization, and we'll cover a couple quick housekeeping items. So the UXPA is the User Experience Professionals Association, and we're working on a number of things this year, including these monthly webinars. We also are bringing you Spanish webinars. We've already had a couple this year, and we'll be bringing you more later this year. And we have some great publications, our User Experience Magazine and the Journal of Usability Studies. I invite you to check out uxpa.org to check out these resources, as well as some other upcoming webinars, and we also are going to be starting a short course program later this year. I don't want to forget to mention our annual conference. It's taking place in just a couple of weeks in Toronto. You can check out uxpa2017.org for more information about our conference. I hope to see you all there. Couple quick housekeeping items before we get started with the webinar. On your, well, depending on your device, for most of us on the right-hand side, there's the little control panel. If you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them into that control panel throughout the webinar. At the end, when Crispin is done with her presentation, I'll field those questions. So we'll have some time there for some Q&A. I think that's it. This is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our website after the presentation. We'll get closed captions added to the webinar, and then we'll upload it back onto our website so you can see that later and share that with others. All right, without further ado, I would like to introduce Crispin Reedy. Crispin is a voice user experience designer and usability professional with over 10 years of frontline design, speech usability, and tuning experience across a variety of industries, including financial, telecommunications, healthcare, and transportation. She's interested in helping teams make excellent design decisions and how we can best leverage real-world data to achieve those goals. She's currently the president of the AVIxD, the Association for Voice Interaction Design. You can find out more information about AVIxD by going to avixd.org. Really excited to have you here today, Crispin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'll go ahead and kick it off. Here is the description of our session today. We're going to be talking about a lot of different topics: chatbots, voice user interface, and speech interfaces, the Alexas, the Siris, distributed speech APIs. What is a conversation? So when I actually originally developed this talk, it was a little too long, so I had to cut a lot out, and there's a lot of stuff here that we could really dig into and spend half a day or a day talking about and discussing in detail. So this one really is kind of the 10,000-foot view, and I'm hoping that at the very least what it'll do is give you an idea of where all these pieces are, how they kind of fit together, and in general what's going on with this area. So first of all, what is a conversational user interface? So in this session, we're going to talk about specifically an interactive communication between two or more people, one of those people of which is a computer. So I do want to talk about both spoken and written because I think that there's a lot in common across these two types of interfaces. And there are also interfaces that do one-shot communication, so one or two commands. It's a little bit more like a control user interface. And there are some types of user interfaces that let you do a little bit more digging into a turn-taking type of conversation. So I'm going to kind of do a quick fly-through of all of these type of things. But first, I want to give you a story. And this will tell you a little bit about who I am and where I came from, and something about where this field originally got going, right? So in the beginning, there was a phone, and there was a business that wanted its companies to call them on the phone. So they hired people to answer the phone, and it was good. And then the little business got bigger and bigger. And there were more people, and there were more different departments in the business, and things started to get confusing. So back in the 90s, they started to develop the little phone menus that you may remember, probably not so fondly, and they called these things interactive voice response. So, for sales, press 1. For marketing, press 2. And this really was the genesis of where speech recognition started to be applied commercially, was on these actual phone-based applications. And if you're really interested in the deep background of speech recognition and the history, I have a couple resources for you at the end of the presentation. It is really interesting because people have been working at understanding human speech for a long time now. And so we are just now really starting to see the fruits of that labor that went all the way back 100 years even. So to return to my story. So press 1 for this, press 2 for that, and things were okay. But then we started to get computers into the mix. And of course, every time, how does the saying go? Anytime you combine a computer and a thing, you get a computer. And so it's quite true. These things started to get more complicated. People started to get more interested in being able to put in an account number or put in a PIN, do a little bit of self-service, maybe actually buy something or get a balance with these before you got to talk to the person. And people started to get a little bit more irritated with these things. And then they started to add speech recognition to these things. Why don't you just tell me what you can say? Remember the Kramer episode in the movie phone? He was pretending to be the speech recognition application. And people started to get a little bit more irritated about these things. Now, one of the things that this industry back in the 90s, one of the things that this area came from is that who were the people who were designing these menus and who were the people who were writing these early conversations? Were they human factors experts? Were they linguistics experts? Were they user-centered designers? Did they know much about usability? Some of the people did, but not very many, especially at the beginning of how these applications started to be developed. In fact, an awful lot of these people who were starting to craft these early conversations, they knew how to use Microsoft Word. And that's where these conversations were starting to be written, is in a Word document where the computer says this thing and the person did that thing. So, as you probably know, because you probably have some experience with these things, it led to a certain amount of annoyance. So, ever since then, as somebody who's interested in conversations and somebody who's interested in speech, we have all been sort of rolling the ball back up the hill, trying to do more usability testing, trying to do more studies about how humans work with these types of systems, and trying to make them better and better and better. Unfortunately, back in the day, they didn't, people had early experiences with them that were kind of negative, and so now we have this rock that we have to roll back up the hill about voice user interfaces not being so good. Now, Siri has certainly gone a long way to encourage people to try these out, but again, it was very interesting because she also saw a user curve where people tried out the speech and then went back to doing it the old way. So, flash forward to this year, and again, bots are getting hot. And as somebody who regularly writes conversations between a computer and a human, I got very interested in learning about chatbots and figuring out how these things were working. This is relevant to my interest, right? So I've been online, built a few bots, been reading some bot blogs, and one of the things that I ran across in a chatbot forum, and I'm sorry I don't have the actual attribution for this forum, but I ran across this post on a chatbot forum, and the writer said, "I'm really excited about chat in natural language because there's no user interface you have to deal with." So hopefully, like me, you are screaming and going, "No, there's still a user interface, it's just a different one." So obviously, facepalm, right? So we've gone from this to annoying phone interface to annoying chat interface, right? So hopefully we can start to claw some of that back as we look at how all of these things could get put together. But it is interesting when we're talking specifically about chatbots now. There is some concern out there that chatbots have been very, very hot, but in fact, there's been a refocusing of the use of chatbots after the bots hit a failure rate of 70%. That's really unfortunate. And this quote down here at the bottom is also really interesting. I think it has a really good pointer into what some of the problems might be. Brands that created bots with a structured request or utility, like Domino's or in retail, were easy. But bots that try to break out of the utility and be chatbots became the problem. So I started with that as my cue. I started thinking about a general type of taxonomy of conversational user interfaces. Obviously, we have the written chatbots, and then we have all types of spoken voice systems. From there, though, I think that the distinction that that gentleman made in the previous slide was a really good one. You've got maybe a broad versus very specific, or maybe an agent versus a task. But I think you see this general tendency, both in chatbots and in voice systems, that some of them are trying to be very general purpose agents that might even have other specific skills on hand inside them. And some of them are trying to be much more specific and do a specific thing. You call up your bank, you get your bank balance, you go online, you try out the 1-800-Flowers bot to order flowers, things like that. So I think this is a very useful taxonomy to bear in mind, that you have a broad or a specific, and which way are you going to try and go with that conversation. Now, similarities, to me, this is a very obvious similarity. Differences do start to come into when you look at the technology. And the voice specifically, I think, has a completely other set of questions that start to come into play when we're looking at a specifically spoken conversational interface. So what thing are you talking to? What else are you connected to? Do you have network connectivity? Do you have access to the back-end account? What kind of speech recognition are you trying to use? How big of a gun do you have to address this problem with, right? And then what else do you have going on? And that goes back to what thing you have. So do you also have a screen? Do you also have touch? Do you also have some motion sensors? Something like that. So this is where, in my mind, the conversational user interface that is more straightforward in terms of a bot or a regular conversation now becomes sort of a 3D problem. So I have redone this slide several times since I've been speaking about voice user interfaces. And every time I redo this slide, it gets more stuff added onto it, because right now there are so many possibilities for what you could talk to that it's just the market increase is pretty cool. So in the upper left hand corner, you could voice enable an application on the phone, a tablet, desktop, laptop, and there are very good reasons to do that depending on what kind of input modality you want to leverage in whatever it is that you've got. So applications that you see for this today could be things like Dragon is doing dictation, or you're seeing some very specific apps that do some speech recognition for games application. The lower left-hand corner is starting to get into your agents. So some of you may recognize the Amazon Alexa, that's the dot. There's also the Echo, the Google Home, which is very similar in terms of this voice-enabled agent/home automation. The little guy in the middle there is Jibo. He's not out yet, but he's a little home agent that's also a robot. So he can move, and he's got a little touch display, and he's kind of a cross between a home agent and a buddy. So he's got, again, yet another set of questions that those designers have to deal with in terms of the display and the motion and coordinating all of those different things together. In the middle, upper middle, we have the started to deal with the things. Now this is where it becomes interesting, right? Is that some of these things can play with some of these agents in the lower left-hand corner. So, you know, voice enable on your watch, maybe your thermostat, the Samsung's smart home fridge. That's a pretty interesting play there, where they've not only got voice recognition in the fridge, but then they've also got the, you know, home center with the computer, and they've got cameras inside the fridge so you can check on the milk. And then of course, you know, the car, the phone, with the call center and the the enterprise applications of it. And I don't want to skim over the car. I mean, that's being a very interesting space because it has its unique user experience perspectives as far as safety. And there's quite a lot of research that's going on out there today about what's safe and what's not safe in the car. Some of the cars are taking the approach of, hey, I'm just going to plug my phone in the car and be done with it. But in fact, you know, the more visuals that you have in the car, the more distracting those visuals are. So there's a gentleman, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I saw him speak at SpeechTEK a couple years ago. If you're interested, hit me up, and I'll dig it out for you. But he was speaking on the research. He was an academic, and he was speaking on the research he had done in his lab about the car and the distracted driver issue. And his findings were that the interface that caused the least amount of distraction was where you could only use your voice and there was no visual, because the visual is what is becoming very appealing to you and is going to tend to make you look at the dashboard as opposed to actually driving. But that's a whole nother area, but it's very interesting. And then the upper right-hand corner, these are kind of the odd ducks of speech recognition, but they're really really cool, right? So industrial applications, for example, I know a fellow who is working on the agricultural applications. So you're out driving around in your tractor, and you're hands-free kind of thing, but you want to take notes as you go about what your fields look like, and that actually have that saved off to database or notes or something like that. So that's very powerful. Warehouses get a lot of voice-enabled picking of parts and pallets and things like that. And then the drone, now that's really neat, because I was just at the SpeechTEK conference a couple months ago and heard a talk about a woman who is actually working on a contract with NASA so that FAA can talk to your drone in sort of pilot speak to actually control the drone from the tower in order to have it be kind of a safety issue. And, you know, basically the tower can tell the drone to get out of the way, things like that, right? So this is all really, really neat stuff, and there's a lot of different ways that speech can be used and will be used in the future. But each one of these has obviously a different consideration as far as how you're going to do the voice user interface, right? So that's kind of the differences of the voice versus chat conversation. You've got the written versus spoken. You've got what are you interfacing to? So all of those things that I was showing you on the previous page, there's issues about discoverability, about onboarding, coordinating voice with other modalities. If any of you have an Amazon Alexa Echo, there's a certain amount of setup that goes into play there. And you know, you have to get the app, you have to play with the app to figure out how to make it do different things. And you know, I'm kind of reminded right now of how the speech landscape is a little bit fragmented. And it reminds me a lot of the consumer electronics landscape. You know, if you ever gone over to your mom's house, and I know my mom's like this, you know, she's got this great audio-visual setup in the living room that Dad did, and she's got 6 remotes, and she's got the little notebook with all of the instructions about how to turn on the television and how to get to the cable, right? And she's got to use all 6 remotes in order to do what she needs to do, right? And so in some ways, today's speech landscape is a little bit fragmented. It's a little bit like that. So, you know, I'm talking about the present and then going into the future. It'll be really interesting to see how that landscape starts to shake out, because I do think in some respects that's not really a technology problem in so much as that's like an enterprise organizational kind of issue, right? Oh, okay, and then I don't do a deep dive into the technologies because I just don't have time, but you know, the technology for speech is a little bit different from the technology for understanding textual understanding. So we call it ASR, automatic speech recognition, versus NLU, natural language understanding. Now, both of those technologies are moving towards more and more sophisticated statistical models that they're calling deep neural networks, machine learning, that kind of thing. It's very cutting edge right now, you know, and the general idea is that you take a very smart algorithm and you give it a bunch of data and then you see what it makes of the data. Now, the problem that we're seeing in these very cutting-edge applications is that, you know, it still is an algorithm. I don't care how smart it is. And so context can be key. So I don't know if you remember Tay, that Microsoft, the chatbot that they put out about a year ago, and they wanted the internet to teach it things. And so the internet taught her to say some very vile and repugnant things, and they wound up unplugging her after about a day. So, you know, context is important in learning in these very cutting edge technologies. Another specific example in the speech recognition arena, we had a client that was doing some speech recognition, and they had primarily American users, but their testing team was in Ireland. And so, again, this was context that maybe should not have been there, but the context was that the testing team was testing against a production server, and so they actually trained that production server to understand English with an Irish accent rather than an American accent. They probably shouldn't have been doing that, right? Not necessarily the best testing protocol, but to my point, you know, the way that these algorithms learn is still something that needs to be guided by a human intelligence. So, what's different? Obviously, there's a lot that's different. But what's in common? Okay, so these are still conversations, right? There's still some kind of flow. You know, we still have to figure out how to correct if we go off topic. We have to figure out how to craft these prompts in order to get some kind of response that we think we understand. And, you know, English is still English, so there's still some conversational maxims that we want to take into account. Well, sort of, right? So let me dig into some of these commonalities. But before I do that, I want to point out that user experience and user research still applies. So I'm not going to dig into this in a ton of detail, but there are still user experience things that we need to do around this, like figure out what tasks you're going to be doing. Do you have personas, and how might the persona change the script you write? You know, then writing a high-level conversation or script, turning around and using that as an input into a usability test is important. Card sorts, you know, is there an information architecture with these things? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Some of them are very flat. Some of them are very one-shot. You say one thing and then you come back. Some of them do have a progression, and if you have a progression, you might have some kind of card sort you might want to do ahead of time. Read aloud, I think, is very important. As you start to do these kinds of conversations, I think you should read the written ones and the ones that are meant to be voiced, either way, because there is still, this user interface is still a user interface that takes place in time, regardless if you have to read it yourself in your head off the screen or if you have to listen to it. It's still something that has to be processed, you know, sequentially. You don't look at the whole screen. You have to read it or you have to listen to it. Usability testing, so my conversations that I write, the script that I generate, then turns around and becomes an input into, by reading aloud, to actual usability testing. Although actually, if you want to do another deep dive into this at some point, I'd love to. But basically with usability testing, you kind of set it up so that you take the voice recognition out of the equation and you just focus on the design. And how you do that is you have somebody behind the screen, Wizard of Oz testing, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And so you have a person behind the scenes who is actually running your prototype as the user interacts with them. Now, it's just one way. I mean, if your technology works great, then maybe you don't need a wizard, but it is kind of fun to, you know, have this baked up in such a way that you have the human that can run it, and then you can rely on the human, as opposed to, you know, technology can fail sometimes when you're doing a usability test. So it's really more akin to being able to show somebody a sketch, like it's an early stage usability test, you know. So like I said, you know, each one of these still applies, and there's a lot of little wrinkles that you get into as you start to use these same tools. There's little differences in each one, but that's kind of my disclaimer there, right? So I'm going to get a little bit into some of the commonalities between the voice conversation and the written conversation. So if you look at the way these conversations are structured, they are really structured very similar. The way you would talk to a human vocally and the way you might chat over a text-based interface. So let's take, for example, a troubleshooting domain. This particular one would be a very broad beginning, right? So, you know, how may I help you today? That's a really open-ended question. And so you would have a large base of natural language utterances behind it that you would try and figure out, all right, what is the domain that this caller wants to do? And this caller would say, I'm calling about a problem with my phone. All right, so again, you know, when we're talking about conversations, people don't necessarily produce neat, structured issue. You know, my phone, the display is blank. You know, they don't spit everything out all at once. What they do is they do come back with these fairly general utterances. You know, people could say, oh, I've got a problem. Okay, so what kind of problem do you have? So this particular person, I don't have any internet, and then we're going to narrow. So we've gone broad, and then the funnel's narrowed down some more, and then we're actually narrowing all the way down to the point where we can start actually talking to them about their specific problem. And we've got some other things that come into play too, right? Like we're implied that in some way we figure out who they are by talking about the actual phone that they've got. And then we can actually narrow all the way down into the yes or no domain and start working our troubleshooting steps from there. And so if you look at the chat conversation, it's very similar. It's just that you have these textual artifacts like prob with phone, no internet connection, but these could be a very similar structure to the voice conversation. And then let's say we actually did some troubleshooting. So this is a sample troubleshooting step. Hey, what about airplane mode? Do you have airplane mode turned off? If you need some help with that, tell me some more. Okay, tell me more. Sure, you can find airplane mode under settings, and we start to troubleshoot this call that way. Versus if you're doing a chat conversation, do you have airplane mode turned off? Yes, no, or I don't know. And here we're supporting IDK, right? So then the similar type of steps could occur in a chat versus a voice. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier. We're talking a little bit about error recovery. So for speech recognition, if the recognizer doesn't get something, you may want to ask them again. So say there's noise in the background, slamming doors, dog barking. We might want to ask them in a different question. Now, with the different types of interfaces, such as the Alexa, for example, if they think that the information is not so crucial, they don't necessarily reprompt. So if you just wake her up, you say Alexa, and then you don't say anything else, she'll just go back to sleep, right? She doesn't come back to you and say, how can I help you? She's not very talkative. And it's very interesting to see how these different interfaces are making these choices of some are more talkative, some are less talkative, right? Like, so Jibo is very talkative because he's got a more personality-based approach. But, so some of these choices, the more you talk, the less you talk, go back to, what are you trying to do with the style for your voice system? So, sorry, I'm getting distracted, but anyway, so I wanted to talk a little bit about fallout here. So these systems could be more directive if you really need the failure. So you could go all the way down to red or press 1 or press something on the user interface if this is really crucial, right? But maybe it's not. Maybe you just need to skip it and go on. So chat does have the same types of error recovery. The difference is it a local recovery versus a global recovery? So you see this example here in chat. I mean, ouch, right? Please select an option above. Let me see main menu. See original options. Go back to all choices. Oh no, this one has not done very well. So this speaks to needing to have some kind of general catch in place to get all of those utterances that you don't understand and include them in the error recovery prompt, right? So same kind of principle, just a little bit different flavor. So speaking specifically about how you write these prompts, the analogy that I've come up with is that, you like to think that they're limited. You like to think that it's like a radio button. But really, even if they're limited in the background, the person who's talking or typing doesn't perceive a limitation, right? Even if there is a limitation, the limitation is invisible. So let's say I write a prompt that says, would you like chocolate or vanilla? And I have in my mind that you're going to respond with chocolate or you're going to respond with vanilla. Like, that's my 2 radio buttons in my head, right? Well, English don't work like that. You could have yes, you could say both, and those are legitimate responses to that prompt. So when you're thinking about, if you're writing a prompt and you're trying to figure out what you're going to get back from the caller or the typer, you have to really think about the big picture and think of it more as a text box. So here's an example, and I'm picking on 1-800-Flowers again, and this is an older example. They've changed this bot extensively since they've written it, which is great, right? They've made it more applicable to how they really saw it working. But so they're trying to order some flowers, and here's my date, and what's the recipient's first name? Change date. Recipient's last name, I'd like it today instead. What's the recipient's phone number? Okay, so what happened here? You know what's happened here. The first name is now change date. The last name is now I'd like it today instead, right? So that's an example of going back to the radio button versus the text box kind of design, right? So that's kind of something you got to think about. And to the point about 1-800-Flowers and what they've done with their bot, it's very interesting to how they've made it much more human fallback, right? So if you get on there today and play with ordering flowers with their bot, they will actually, if you have any difficulty, they've got an agent that's going to swoop right in there and try and assist you with that transaction. They don't let you struggle like this anymore. So that's the way they've directed that system now. All right, so more on what conversations have in common. So these are really neat, right? Paul Grice and the Gricean maxims for conversation. Paul Grice was a philosopher of language, and the interesting thing about these maxims is they are not really, they don't, what they're meant to do is they're meant to say, this is how people, they're meant to describe, this is how people talk. And people break these maxims all the time. But when you break these maxims, what happens is that people either assume that you implied something that maybe you didn't mean to imply, or they're going to assume that there's some kind of problem. So for example, to these maxims of quantity and also relation, I'll give you a specific example. Let's say that I'm a philosophy professor and I'm writing a letter of recommendation to another philosophy school about a student. And in the letter I write, student XYZ is always on time to class and he writes English very well. And I don't say anything about his philosophy skills, right? So there's either a problem, did you understand that it was a philosophy recommendation letter? Or is this writer of the letter implying something like, ooh, he's not a very good philosophy student if all I could think of to say was that he's on time to class, right? So how these roll out into actual designs of conversations, so I have a few specific examples here. Be informative as is required, but not more informative. So really zero on what the user's trying to do. Here's the Taco Bell bot, I believe, for Slack. I think this is still in beta. But here we go, Taco Bot. Let's see what we've got so far. That's one soft taco for $2.19. Are you ready to check out, or do you want to keep this thing going? Just say check out if you're ready, or feel free to add and customize more food. Tip: you can remove or customize any item in your order by just saying remove crunchy taco or customize bean burrito. You can also say remove item 4 or customize item 1 if you'd rather go by item number. Either way works, whatever floats your boat. Oh my God, I'm exhausted just reading that, right? And obviously this is a written interface. It's not to be read aloud, but you can also see it's just a lot of stuff on the page, right? So if you just look at it, it's a lot of stuff. And then you read it aloud and you're like, wow, that's even more. That's a big cognitive load on the user. I think we should really edit some of that out and figure out how to be a little bit more transparent for these busy people, right? Let me give you another example. Being relevant, right? Users want to do what they want and not what you want them to do. And in the context of bots, this really comes to maintaining state. Now, maintaining state is interesting because bots struggle with it, and some of the new conversational user interface tools struggle with it as well. But if you don't maintain state, this is what you get. What's the weather like this weekend? Are you on a boat? Because I was not able to find any results for that location. What's the weather like in Brooklyn this weekend? The weather in Brooklyn, New York is 46 degrees Fahrenheit and clear. This weekend, excusez-moi, this weekend? Sorry, dozed off for a second. What were you saying? All right, so at that point, you're really wanting to kill this bot, right? So maintaining state And also, I'm not talking about it in this presentation, but how much do you personalize these bots in terms of their chattiness and attitude, right? Chatty attitude is all great until it goes wrong, and then you start wanting to slap the thing, right? So these last four, I don't have a specific example for them, but it's kind of interesting how these four are so simple, but then they can still be very hard to do, right? So no jargon. People are going to tend to write according to the language of their company or what they know, but you really need to write according to the language of the user or the caller. Ambiguity, this and that, those can really bite you. So if you want to be careful about how you're referring to sentences before and after, things like that. Brief, I think that goes back to Taxonomy. And then orderly, if you've got an IA, then these things, they really live and die by an IA if you've got one. Because if you've got a maze of conversation that they have to find their way around in, they're really not going to do well if they have to continually navigate around and they get lost. These can be really hard to find your way around if you've got lots of steps. So that really was just kind of a high-level zoom through similarities. There are probably more. These are just the ones that really stood out to me as being uncommon across the chat and voice interface, and as being very conversational. I want to dig a little bit into the differences, pull this slide up again, because again, here's where the things that on the right-hand side really start to come into play is the differences, the connections, the input modalities, things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about if you want to do a speech application today, how might you do it? And then how does it play into those differences as I discussed on the previous page? And again, this is just a 10,000-foot view, okay? So the top two boxes on this page are both network-based speech recognition that is depending on the cloud in it to do your voice recognition, and also could be your natural language understanding, right? So, and then the bottom two come into if you want to start to really get out the big guns and do some heavy-duty speech recognition, you might want to download it, tweak it, customize it, and do it on your own device. Obviously, you would need programmers, help, that kind of thing. But I wanted to show you these four different possibilities because the way you write for any one of these four could be very different. And also, if you're just starting to get your toe wet with speech, the first two are very easy to get into. But let's say you have a really powerful, cool application in mind and you try out the first two and you're like, oh, that doesn't work for me. Well, I just want to make you aware that numbers 3 and 4 are out there for you as well if you're designing some kind of product or experience where you really need some power behind it. So let's look at these briefly. When we're talking about speech agents, Siri, Google Now, Amazon, Alexa, Echo, these, Alexa's trying to be a little person, a little helper that can help you out. And so with Alexa, and the other ones, have this similar kind of structure with Cortana as well, where you can have these skills that you can download off of Amazon. So let's say you wanted to try out writing an Amazon Alexa skill. The person who needs to find this skill would go on to Amazon and try and get this skill, download this skill to the Alexa. And then you could play with all these different kinds of Alexa, play Jeopardy, Alexa, open Find Phone, open Radio Mystery Theater, all of these different skills for the Alexa, okay? So I want to point that out, that how that is a little bit different from actually using the Alexa API or another API to do the speech recognition, right? So the Alexa skill, I think Capital One has one where you can access your Capital One bank, and how that is different from actually using Amazon's distributed or Google's distributed speech recognition, right? So how that would work is you've got a gizmo that you wanted to make speech enabled. you you want to speech enable a coffee pot. Okay, so you're a coffee pot maker, and so you've got a microphone and a speaker in your coffee pot. And so then you want to be able to talk to the coffee pot and say, coffee pot, brew me 6 cups or whatever, right? So you could then use Alexa voice services or another speech-based API to then capture that audio and understand, oh, all right, 6 cups of coffee, got it. And then what would be the response? Coffee pot would say, all right, 6 cups of coffee coming up. Or maybe you would want another turn in there. Let's say you had different types of beans in the hopper. The coffee pot might want to say, hey, do you want the dark roast or do you want the light roast? So that's where the turn taking starts to come into play, right? So, but again, you see how that's different from the skill, because now you're talking to the coffee pot directly, versus if you're talking about an Alexa skill, you're still talking to the Alexa, okay? So, and then this slide here, I wanted to speak a little bit to the bottom 2 potential approaches on that 4 green square slide, right? So this is going above and beyond, you know, Alexa, Google Home, that kind of thing, where, you know, on the left is where you've got what I'm calling the cloud-based APIs, where you can really get started easily, not a lot of cost to just take it out, try it out, kick the tires, you know, but again, they have their sets of what they can do. So if you wanted to start, let's say, talking to a drone or a tractor, then maybe this is where you want to think about rolling your own, especially if you don't want to deal with the network or you're not going to be on the network, right? Or if you want, say, let's say you got a very robust environment, sorry, a very noisy environment, and you want a very robust speech recognition. Right? So that might be an option where you would go above and beyond. But again, that would be something where you would want a speech scientist to maybe get involved, a little more tweaking. There's open source available, and this is sort of more cutting edge. But on the left-hand side, there's a lot of cool stuff out there that you can get started with, kicking the tires and voice enabling whatever you want to voice enable. So, each one of these has a different type of use case, right? Speech on the desktop, speech on the tablet, industrial device, the gadget, the car, the IVR. There's different sets of consideration that you want to look at as you're looking at a product or a conversation that you're trying to come up with, right? So, you know, when I talked, I gave not the same talk, but an earlier discussion of this talk at Dallas Tech Fest a couple years ago, and there's a lot of interest in there about startups wanting to speech enable things. And, you know, I said, look, there's some things that have a really great use case for speech, and there are some applications that have a low cost of entry. So either one of those, you know, is a good reason to go ahead and at least get it out, kick the tires, play with it. But at the same time, you know, speech is not going to be the end all and be all for everything, right? I mean, if there's a really interesting use case, then that's great. But if there's not, then it may or may not be something that you want to look at. So this, I have a bunch of caveats here. But you know what? I'm such a designer, right? Should I do it? It depends, right? It really depends on what you want to do. So, to revisit our statement here, learning from existing VUI design, making them pass, and so now I didn't really talk very much about the future. And I think it's very interesting to at least think about what the future might be like. And, you know, if you're at all familiar with the different ways that this user interface gets expressed in science fiction, right? This is what we're up against. And so in some respects, I just want to play this for you. Hopefully this will work. If it doesn't work, somebody IM me or let me know that this video doesn't work, because I want this is what, as far as speech user interfaces, it's like we're really up against this really amazingly sexy thing that is really hard to do. So let me just create, let me choose this.
1974 Spark Expo model scan complete set. How many buildings are there? How many to include the Belgian waffle stands? That was rhetorical, just show me. What does that look like to you, Jarvis? Not unlike an animal, in which case the ethics be here. Highlight the insert. Where's the fruit pants? You're ready. What is it you're trying to achieve, sir? I'm discovering, correction, I'm rediscovering a new element. Loose landscape in the shrubbery, the trees, parking lot, exits, entrances. Structural protons and neutrons. Using the pavilions.
So that's not just a conversational user interface, right? That's an everything user interface. He's got touch, he's got this amazing display, he's coordinating the pointer with his hand, you know, he's zooming in and zooming out, he's selecting things, and he's talking at the same time. So, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future because I wanted to say, you know what, that's what we're up against. I mean, when people come to these conversational user interfaces, they have this expectation of, wow, you know, I want to be able to talk to my computer in the same way that I want to be able to talk to a person. Of course, you know, that's right up there with, it's 2017, where's my flying car, right? We're all a little disappointed that the technology has not achieved where we think it can be. Now, I do think in terms of all of these problems to put Jarvis together, you know, it certainly is a possibility, but where the gap between where we are today and where we are in the future, there's a lot of exciting and interesting work to be done between now and then. So hopefully we'll see Jarvis, but you know, it's kind of one of those things where keeping my fingers crossed and let's just see what the cutting edge scientists come up with. So, and oh yes, plenty of resources. Okay, so if you're interested in getting a little bit more in the history of voice recognition, there's this book called The Voice and the Machine, Building Computers That Understand Speech, by a friend and former colleague of mine, Roberto Pericini. And he actually has a talk, if you prefer video, on YouTube called Open the Pod Bay Doors Series, which is a really great talk, and I highly recommend it. And it's kind of more of a deep background of this technology and the problems that we're dealing with in this space. Now, as far as what we've got today, there's some standards that are coming out from Google and from Alexa, and you know, I'm sure there's more out there. These were just the two that I came up with. And they've kind of started the conversation as far as, you know, conversational design around their platform. So the Google Actions, the Alexa Skills. Now, I will say that these particular resources are based around what they can do, right? So they've got a very specific point of view, and if you're writing for their platform, that's great. I'm going to plug here my organization, which we're kind of trying to take the big picture view, kind of being platform agnostic, and we actually have a wiki that is fairly robust in terms of some types of conversational interaction design, but we would like to continue opening up and building the wiki and you know, the best practices recommendations as we move forward into these new skills, into the new Google Actions, and into the chatbot world. So we're always looking for new members, we're looking for volunteers, we're looking for people who would like to continue the conversation, come to some workshops. And we've also got brown bags and a journal and all that good stuff. So, you know, just hit us up online, and would love to continue the conversation with you if you want to get further into it. And that is all I have, and I believe we have 5 minutes left. I'm not sure how the questions work.
Awesome. I will field the questions. Yep, I'll read them out to you. That was amazing. Thank you so much. We have lots of questions, so I know we're not going to get through all of these, but we will do our best. Let's see. What solutions are available for deaf or hearing impaired users, specifically voice to text?
That's very interesting. Okay, so that is something that actually many of the phone manufacturers specifically are building those modalities right into the phone. So if you start looking at the accessibility options on your phone, you'll see that definitely the iPhone, and I believe the Android as well, has those kinds of things that are specifically, they actually will specifically verbally present what's on the screen to, no wait, I'm sorry, you said deaf, didn't you? I went the other direction. Could you read the question again?
This is specifically solutions for deaf or hearing impaired.
For deaf or hearing impaired. Sorry, I went to visually impaired. Okay. Deaf or hearing impaired. Now that, okay, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I would have to take that away and think about it, because that is not something I'm familiar with right off the bat. So.
Okay. Do you foresee regional languages as a challenge for CUI?
Very much so. One of the things that we have to do is make sure and internationalize anything that we deploy, right? If you're going to roll it out in a different country. And it's not just for different languages, it's for different types of English in different countries. For example, you know, American English is a different flavor from British English, is a different flavor from Australian English. And it's not just the actual speech recognition, but there's cultural baggage there's cultural ramifications around how your voice sounds as well. So I'll give you a specific example. We did a deployment that was internationalized to Australia, and we were trying to choose a voice for the system, and the voice that we wanted to convey young, hip, kind of happening, young guy. And so we did a casting call for the voice talent, and we had 5 talents, and we had the American team rate the voice talent on different perspectives of the actual brief that we wrote up for the talent, and the American team rated them completely different from the Australian team. So of course we went with the local team, but I mean I didn't expect that, you know, the way that this voice presented himself would be perceived so differently across cultures, but it is.
Interesting. Excuse me. A couple of folks asked about the academic research that voice only is less distracting.
Mm-hmm.
I know you provided some resources there at the end. I don't know if you have anything in there about the research around that.
Yeah, so maybe I could, so that gentleman's name has escaped me at the time. I will have to go look him up around the car. But is there a way we could communicate that out to people after the session?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, if you have any resources at all, we can send an email out to all attendees.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Let's see, along those lines, what is the scope of research at the moment in relation to multimodal interaction and conversational UI?
It's very cutting edge. So, you know, there's a lot of different types of academic research going on right now in terms of how to coordinate the different modalities. I will say that, you know, as a human, one of the things you want to recognize is to try and not force people into a given modality if you have the capability to support those different modalities, right? So, you know, my former colleague, John Bloom, has this really good example where if you walk into a bakery and, you know, you point at the cake and say, I want that one. The person behind the counter does not say, this is a speech-enabled bakery. Please say the name of the donut you want, you know. And it's also, and if you say, I would like a chocolate donut, the person behind the counter does not say, please point to the donut you want. So there's some good finding out there about, if you've got those different modalities, choosing them. But academically, there's a lot of different stuff going on in the different journals about that.
This is kind of similar. Do you see a need for chatbots to offer users a way out to chat with a human?
Yes, and that's actually the way. So let me caveat. What is the purpose of your chatbot? For 1-800-Flowers, their purpose of their chatbot was, we want you to order flowers. And so they actually brought the human in very early in the interaction because they want you to get those flowers ordered. And so I think, if you've got a specific task that you're trying to accomplish and the bot is repeatedly failing, there's definitely a good case to be made that you should bring the human in, as soon as that person seems to be struggling.
Okay, awesome. We have a few folks also who mentioned that they couldn't follow the video, so maybe in the follow-up material, if you can send a link to that, that would be helpful too.
Sure. Okay, will do.
Cool. All right, well, we are out of time. Sorry, folks, that we didn't get through all of the questions, and thank you so much, Crispin. This was really, really a great talk. I'm so happy that you were able to join us and present for us today. Just a reminder, everyone, this has been recorded, and we will be sharing the recording on our website later. All right, thank you, Crispin.
Okay, thanks so much.
Take care.